Welcome to Purple Palace Podcast, connecting cannabis culture worldwide. I'm Cannamandi, and today I thought I would do a solo episode for you guys on an exposition of cannabis over the past century in the United States. So, I'm really excited to talk about this subject because personally, I am so passionate about cannabis since I found out that it was a medicine. I just felt like it was hidden from me for my entire childhood. And when I turned 18, I got my doctor's recommendation to help me with my back pain. And from then on, I was just fascinated with why so many people hated on this plant, especially my parents. Like, my parents just were so against it. And then later, my mom became more accepting of it, but, it just depends. Like, people just have this stigma against it, and so I think that has a lot to do with some of the points that I'll touch in today's episode. So, to start, the legal history of cannabis in the United States began very far back, really in recorded history. It starts in 1906 onward, and we see prohibitions breaking out because cannabis is just an all-inclusive plant. And I was watching a National Geographic YouTube video, and it talked about how cannabis, specifically industrial hemp farming, hemp plants can produce almost anything you need it to, right? It can produce materials to build houses, to build clothing. It's a healing herb. It can be put into teas, tinctures, creams. Even car dealers such as Mercedes and other high class Ford. Henry Ford actually made a car out of hemp, and so it's known to be a very durable material. So, anyways, a lot of the reasons that cannabis was outlawed had to do with the nylon companies. At the time, there was a very rich family, the DuPont family, and so they were responsible for the invention of nylon, and so it was a competing fabric with hemp during the time of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, and so ultimately the government decided to tax hemp and marijuana to send the hemp companies out of business, so that the big businesses did not have to compete. And so that's really how it started out being demonized. It was just a lot because of big business. And so then as that continued on, there were other factors that came into play. For example, the cannabis plant was very popular to be smoked in the lower class population, because the plant, since it made them feel that higher effect, it made them feel that they were on the same level as the aristocrats and the upper class people of the society during that time. And so basically the upper class males in the political system in particular didn't like these lower class men looking at their wives and daughters, and they wanted to keep ultimately the families together in the higher class white privileged society. They didn't want this intermixing in the lower class society. So they demonized cannabis because they didn't want these people to feel on the level of the higher class individuals. And so there is actually a scientific backing of why it makes you feel this way. And so there have been CB receptors identified in the body, cannabinoid receptors. There are 4 known right now. 2 have been named, CB1 and CB2, and these are found all along the spinal cord, the eyes, the lymphatic system, and just all throughout the body. And they can actually help you to regulate your body's systems. And so when these people in the lower class were, feeling down or sad, they would smoke some cannabis, and it would just make them feel a little better. And so, they would say, life isn't so bad at that point. And so the government didn't really like that these people were feeling the confidence to, take the upper people's opportunities. So basically, the plant was just continuously bashed upon without any evidence of it being harmful. And cannabis was officially outlawed for any use, medical included, with the passage of the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. That was the act which made cannabis a Schedule I drug. And so ultimately, these committees can just put so much money into play, and they can just get cannabis put onto this list, and it's all just a large monopoly essentially. So so many people are getting their medicine messed with because of this, and that's why I just want everyone to be educated on this cause and just to know this history, because I didn't know anything about this until I researched it for myself. So I just thought that this is something that I wanted to share with all of you. So multiple efforts to reschedule cannabis under the Controlled Substances Act have failed, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative and during Gonzalez versus Raich that the federal government does have a right to regulate and criminalize cannabis, even for medical purposes. So essentially, just because they're saying so, they are now just sending millions of people to jail, thousands, or it might be thousands. I'm not sure if it's in the millions yet. I don't know the exact statistic. I can look that up right now. How many people have gone to jail due to cannabis? Over time, it could be millions. We don't really have that documented. So yeah, it's just insane how we need to stand up for our rights, and the first thing in that is knowing our rights. So I've been listening to YouTube videos of the Constitution just being read aloud when I'm in the car, and I think that it's just a great tool. YouTube is an amazing tool. I feel like I've learned so much for free just on YouTube alone. So back to the exposition. So during these trials, essentially the federal government just said, we have all the say. We can send you to prison for having cannabis and for, any reason if cannabis is involved. So what happened after that point on was California was really the hub for the cannabis prohibition. We had cannabis activists. One to name was Jack Herer, and so he was protesting on a federal lawn one day, and the politician at the time saw him protesting, and he said, what have the Canadians done to make us so mad at them? And he had mistaken the cannabis leaf he had mistaken the Canadian flag, or the cannabis leaf as the Canadian flag. Okay. And so basically, this politician said, let me see what I can do. And his colleague said, these protesters have a right to be here. But ultimately, this politician came back and he said, you are in violation of the Sedition Act. And so what the Sedition Act is it is an act that states that you cannot occupy federal property after dark during times of war. And so Jack Herer said to him, he knew what that act had meant. And so he said to him, there's no war going on. And the man said, well, we're at war with you. So ultimately, just because anyone could, find that gray area in the federal government and ultimately, try and mess with you. So that's why, again, it's very important to stay educated. And so I'm just amazed at knowing all of this information. I feel like information is definitely power. So ultimately, Jack Herer, he did not pay the fine, because he felt that it was unjust. All of the other protesters did pay the $5 fine. It was only $5 at the time. And so ultimately he ended up going to prison for 15 days. And in prison he outlined this book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes. It is an amazing book. I'm currently reading it, and it is so informational. It talks about cannabis and how he actually helped to legalize cannabis in the Proposition 215 Act that was passed in 1996 in California, which basically stated that patients could legally be prescribed cannabis by a doctor. With a doctor recommendation, they could actually purchase cannabis from dispensaries and delivery services and or growers. And so it just created this spark and this movement. And so Prop 215 allowed so much room for so many cannabis businesses in California. And in 2012, the first states actually legalized recreational use. And so with that, we've seen the government has been taking very high taxes out of cannabis businesses, including Proposition 64 in California. So what that did was it gave the different counties ultimately the choice right off the bat of whether they wanted to go with the recreational cannabis system, where people then have to apply for recreational permits in that county, or you can go into, if you have a cannabis business in a medical county, such as El Dorado County. That's why we see medical dispensaries there still accepting doctors' recommendations. And so it's just up to the county, and that's why, in the states individually. So ultimately, that's what's happening right now with cannabis. There is still a long way to go with the acceptance fully of cannabis as a medicine and as a useful plant. It's known as the miracle plant because it can literally save the world from destruction in so many ways. The plant is so much more eco-friendly than using plastics and other building materials. It's just completely compostable, and it's also known to be one of the strongest materials. So overall, cannabis and hemp are just amazing plants, and I love weed. Thank you guys very much for watching for listening, I'm sorry. And I hope that you learned something today. Please give this video a like and subscribe, and check out the video next week. Thank you guys, and peace out.